For centuries, the greatest kingdom of the Elves was not defended by stone walls or steel armies, but by the memory and will of a single, divine being. She was an angel who wove a living barrier of shadow and confusion, a power so absolute that it made a mockery of all physical defenses. To compare the Black Gate of Mordor to this barrier is to compare a locked door to an endless, shifting maze that ensnared the mind itself, turning armies to dust and confounding the senses of the wise. This is the chronicle of Melian, a Maia of the race of the Valar, who forsook the timeless bliss of the undying lands to bind her fate to a mortal world, all for the sake of love. Before the sun and moon first rose, in the ageless twilight of the years of the trees, Melian dwelt in the blessed realm of Valinor. She was of the Maisiar, divine spirits of lesser degree than the Valar, but powerful beyond the measure of mortals. She served Vadina, the ever-young, and Este, the gentle. And in the gardens of Lorien, she was the tender of the trees that flowered in the eternal evening. Her voice was the most beautiful in all the land, and when she sang, the Valar themselves would pause their work, and the very fountains of Lorien would fall silent to listen. The nightingales were her companions, and she taught them their enchanting songs. But a yearning grew within her. She was drawn to the deep shadows and the starlit twilights of the outer lands, to the world that would one day be called Middle-earth. And so, in the youth of the world, she departed from Valinor, passing into the mortal realms alone, filling the silence of the forests with her divine voice and the songs of her attendant nightingales. It was an act of profound curiosity, a desire to know the world that lay beyond the sight of the gods, an act that would change the destiny of elves and men forever. At this time, the great journey of the elves from their awakening in Quivien was underway. They were marching westward, called by the Valar to live in the light of the trees. One of their leaders was Elwë Singolo, lord of the Teleri. He was tall and noble, with silver hair and eyes that held the light of the stars. While journeying through the great forests of the land of Beleriand, he often sought solitude in the woods, listening to the strange new sounds of a world still awakening. One evening, he heard a song that pierced his heart. It was the voice of Melian, accompanied by her nightingales. Drawn by an enchantment he could not resist, he passed deep into the primordial forest of Nan Elmoth. There, in a glade lit by the starlight that filtered through the leaves, he saw her. He was utterly captivated by her divine beauty, and she, in turn, looked upon him and saw in his eyes the light of Aman that he so desperately sought, yet also the twilight of the mortal world she had come to love. A spell fell upon them. He took her hand, and they stood motionless, locked in a silent gaze, while the long years of the stars wheeled overhead. The trees of Nan Elmoth grew tall and dark around them, and the world outside changed. His people, the Teleri, searched for their lost lord, but they could not find him. Many passed on over the sea, but a great part remained, unwilling to abandon their king. The ages passed like a breath. But what is the cost of loving a divine being? What happens when a king vanishes, and his people are left adrift in a darkening world? This single moment of love would secure a kingdom, but it would also sow the seeds of a terrible jealousy that would one day bring it to ruin. When Elwë and Melian at last returned, the spell broken, he was a changed being. He was now known as Ilu Thingol, the King Greymantle, and his face was like that of a lord of the Maiar, his silver hair a crown, his presence one of awe and majesty. Melian stood beside him as his queen, and her power and wisdom flowed through him. The scattered elves who had remained in Beleriand, the Sindar, rallied to their king. In the heart of the forest of Regen, they established a hidden kingdom. Its name was Doriath, the land of the fence, and in its center, they delved the mighty fortress of Menegroth, the Thousand Caves, a marvel of craftsmanship, aided by the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. For many long ages, Doriath was a realm of peace and bliss, protected from the outside world. Thingol ruled as a mighty lord, and Melian's wisdom guided his counsel. It was an echo of Valinor and the mortal lands, a sanctuary of starlight and song, untouched by the growing evils of the world. They were content in their isolation. But no peace lasts forever in Middle-earth. Far to the west, in the Undying Lands, a catastrophe had occurred. Melkor, now named Morgoth, the first and greatest of the Dark Lords, had destroyed the two trees that gave light to the world. With the aid of the primordial spirit of darkness, Ungoliant, he had poisoned the heart of Valinor and murdered the king of the Noldoran elves. He stole their most prized treasures, the Silmarils, 3 jewels containing the last pure light of the trees. Then, He fled back to his ancient fortress of Angband in the north of Middle-earth. Darkness fell upon the world. Morgoth's power grew, and his legions of orcs, a foul mockery of the elves, began to spill forth into Beleriand. They came without warning, a tide of violence and hatred, slaying and burning all they found. The peaceful Sindar were unprepared. This was the first battle of Beleriand. And though the elves were valiant, they were scattered and outnumbered. Thingol's forces were driven back into their forest heartland. The age of peace was shattered. It was then that Melian revealed the true nature of her power. She knew that walls of stone and armies of elves would not be enough to withstand the malice of Morgoth, a fallen Vala whose evil permeated the very soil of the world. She needed a defense that could not be broken by siege engines or laid low by sorcery. She needed a weapon of the mind. So she put forth her ancient, divine power. She wove an enchantment of shadow and bewilderment, a vast, invisible fence that surrounded the entire core of her kingdom, the forests of Neldoreth and region. It was not a wall of matter, but a wall of perception, a living, breathing barrier, powered by her will and her memory of the light of Valinor. This was the Girdle of Melian, the unlight against which no evil could pass. To an outsider, the forest would seem to become a labyrinth of impenetrable gloom. Paths would vanish. Landmarks would shift. A sense of dread and utter confusion would seize any who tried to force their way through. Armies would become lost, wandering in circles for years until they died of starvation, never seeing the sun again. Even the most powerful servants of Morgoth, masters of deception and shadow, found their senses betrayed. They could feel the kingdom was there, just beyond their sight, but they could never find the way in. It was a flawless, absolute defense. Doriath became a hidden island of peace in a world now plunged into war. For centuries, it remained inviolate, a legend whispered by its enemies, a sanctuary for its people. The power of a single Maia held back the entire might of the Dark Lord. But the greatest threats to a fortress are not always from without. Melian had foreseen Morgoth's evil, but she had not foreseen the evil that elves could do to other elves. A new danger was coming, not from the dark pits of Angband, but from across the sea. The Noldor were returning to Middle-earth, brilliant and terrible, driven by a dreadful oath and stained by the blood of their own kin. They brought with them the light of Valinor, but also a shadow of doom that would follow them everywhere they went. And even Mesilien's power was subject to a higher authority. Fate. Her girdle could halt armies, confuse sorcerers, and turn back the darkness of Morgoth. But could it stop one single mortal man walking towards his destiny? For there was a power at work in the world that even the wisest of the Maiar could not wholly command, and it was about to send an intruder into her perfect, hidden kingdom, an intruder who would not be turned aside. His name was Beren, son of Barahir, a man of the house of Beor, last of his company of outlaws who had defied Morgoth's power in the northern wastes. He was a hunted man, broken by grief and loss, driven south by a despair so profound it had become its own form of power. But why did the girdle fail? How could this one man, a mere mortal, weary and alone, succeed where entire armies of orcs and sorcerers of Angband had been utterly defeated? Was it a flaw in Melian's design? A momentary lapse in her power? The answer is far more complex, and reveals a truth about Melian that is both terrifying and magnificent. What if it wasn't a failure? What if the greatest defensive enchantment ever woven had a secret? A built-in exception? Designed from its very inception? A keyhole waiting for a specific key. Melian was a Maia. She saw not just the world of matter, but the unfolding music of creation. She could perceive the great patterns of fate, the threads of destiny that even the Valar in Valinor could not reweave. And she had foreseen this. She knew that a great doom was laid upon the Noldor, but she also saw that a greater destiny was at work in the world, one that would entwine the fates of elves and men. She foresaw the birth of her own daughter, Luthien, the most beautiful of all the children of Ilúvatar, and she foresaw that her daughter's fate was tied to a mortal man, a man who would walk out of despair and into her hidden kingdom. The Girdle of Melian was not merely a wall, it was a filter. It was woven to deny all those with malice in their hearts, to turn away the servants of darkness and the proud who would seek to conquer. But it was also woven to yield to one whose destiny was so great, so integral to the song of the world, that to deny him would be to fight against creation itself. So Benerin passed through the girdle, not by breaking it, but by being permitted by it. He wandered lost and amazed within the protected realm of Doriath, a land untouched by winter or decay. And it was there, in a glade by the river Escalduin, that his destiny found him. He saw Luthien, daughter of Thingol and Melian, dancing in the twilight. The sight of her beauty and grace healed his heart of all its pain. He was struck dumb, believing he had stumbled into a vision of Valinor itself. When he finally called out to her, naming her Tinuviel, the nightingale, she stopped, and in that moment, a doom was awakened, a love that would defy the Lord of Darkness and change the course of the world forever. But this love, born of fate, was also the seed of Doriath's undoing. For when Luthien brought Beren before her father, King Thingol, the sanctuary's internal weakness was finally exposed. Thingol, proudest of all the Sindarin lords, looked upon the mortal man with scorn. A mortal? Presuming to ask for the hand of his daughter, the heir of Doriath, a being who had the blood of the Maiar in her veins? The insult was unimaginable. He wished to have Bedrin killed on the spot. But it was then that Melian spoke, her voice calm but filled with the weight of ages. "My lord," she said, "this man's fate is not in your hands to end. And be warned, whether he lives or dies, a doom will now be laid upon Doriath that your power cannot prevent." She saw the future branching before them. She saw the path of pride and the path of wisdom, and she saw her husband, blinded by his own arrogance, choosing the darker road. Thingol, restrained by Melian's warning and Luthien's love, did not kill Beren. Instead, he devised a cruel and impossible task. He declared that a mere mortal was unworthy of his daughter. But if Beren wished to prove his worth, he would perform a feat no elf, not even the great Noldoran princes, had ever dared. He would go to the fortress of Angband, pry open the iron crown of Morgoth himself, and bring back one of the Silmarils. Only then would he be worthy to marry Luthien. He intended it as a death sentence wrapped in a king's decree, a way to be rid of the mortal without directly defying his wife's prophecy. He thought his cunning was absolute. He was a fool. Melian's heart was filled with dread. This was the moment she had feared. Her power could hold back the physical armies of the Dark Lord, but it could not protect her family from the consequences of their own choices. She warned him directly. "O king," she whispered, "you have devised your own doom. By this oath you have woven the fate of Doriath into the fate of the Silmarils. You have coveted the work of Feanor, and you will share in the curse that lies upon them. Your kingdom is now forfeit." But Thingol would not listen. His pride was a wall higher and thicker than any enchantment. And so Beren, with nothing but his courage and his love for Luthien, set out from the hidden kingdom on a quest for the divine jewel. A quest that would lead him into the deepest heart of horror, but a quest that would also draw that horror back towards the one safe place left in Beleriand. Mendilian's perfect sanctuary was now compromised, not by an invading army, but by the greed of its own king. The girdle still stood, but a chain of events had been set in motion that would ultimately tear it apart from the inside. For the Silmaril was not just a jewel. It was an object of absolute power, containing the holy light of the trees. But it was also stained by a terrible oath, and tainted by the bloodiest deeds in the history of the Elves. And by demanding it, Thingol had just invited that curse into the heart of his home. And so the quest was achieved. Against all hope, Beren and Luthien returned from the very gates of Angband, and the Silmaril, wrested from the Iron Crown, lay in Thingol's hand. Its sacred light filled the halls of Menegroth, a living memory of the bliss of Valinor. But the light of the trees did not bring wisdom, only a consuming fire of possession. Thingol, obsessed, sought to merge the jewel with the famed necklace of the dwarves, the Noglamir, uniting the greatest works of elf and dwarf into one peerless treasure. In this, the curse of Feanor found its final purchase. A dispute over payment and ownership, fueled by pride and greed on both sides, became a river of blood. The dwarves, inflamed by the jewel's beauty and the king's arrogance, slew Thingol in his own treasure halls. With the death of her beloved, Melian's heart was finally broken. The sorrow was too great, her purpose in Middle-earth now a ruin. She departed from the mortal world, returning to the gardens of Lorien to grieve for an age. And with her went her power. The sanctuary was no more. The doom she had foretold had come to pass. Yet the Silmaril endured, passing to Beren and Luthien's heir. But its light was a beacon not only of hope, but of a ruinous, unforgotten oath. The surviving sons of Feanor heard tale of it, and descended upon the recovering kingdom. Again the jewel was saved, carried south by the Lady Elwing to the last refuge at the havens of Sirion. But the oath gave no rest. It pursued the Silmaril to the shores of the Great Sea, where the sons of Feanor fell upon their own kin for the third and final time. To escape the carnage, Elwing cast herself into the waves, the Silmaril clasped to her breast. But her fate was not to drown. The Vala Ulmo, Lord of Waters, lifted her up, transforming her into a great white bird to seek her beloved, Irindil the Mariner, across the sea. With the light of the Silmaril now bound to his brow, Irindil did what none had dared. He sailed his vessel into the heavens themselves, past the shadows and the enchanted isles, to beg for the pardon and the aid of the Valar in the Undying Lands. And the Valar heard his plea. The host of the West came like a storm of light and thunder, and the great battle, the War of Wrath, was fought. The might of Angband was broken, and Morgoth was cast from the world into the timeless void. In the ruin of that war, the lands of Beleriand were drowned beneath the waves. The last two Silmarils were reclaimed from Morgoth's crown, only to be lost forever. One to the fiery chasms of the earth, the other to the deepest waters of the ocean. The jewels of Feanor, which had caused such glory and such grief, were now sundered, held by the three kingdoms of Arda, the sky, the earth, and the sea. The great tale of the elder days was over. One alone was set in the sky as a star of hope for the peoples of a new age. A promise that even after the longest night, a new dawn will come. The first age was ended, but the music of creation is not finished. New lands will rise, new evils will stir, and the story of the Rings of Power is yet to be told. To witness the dawn of the second age, the fall of Numenor, and the last alliance of elves and men, subscribe to the _Silmarillion_Chronicles, the great legendarium of Middle-earth.